It's time for the Chapter and Chatter Cafe with Camden County Library District Director, Professor Jim Pasley. Morning. Welcome to another edition of the Chapter and Chatter Cafe. I'm KB along with the CCLD Director, the one and only Professor Jim Pasley, and we're glad to have you with us this morning for another adventure into, well, this morning, how about the federal government? We're going to be talking about the Federalist Papers, among other things. Plus, we'll touch on a whole mess of great items, great topics, great events that are coming up with the Camden County Library District. As a matter of fact, they've got their summer reading program that they're all excited about. In the month of June, it kicks off, and they're going to have a big event. We'll tell you more about that. So today, we decided that we would touch on the Federalist Papers with good reason.
Yes.
And I think that you are going to learn a lot about, hopefully, how the federal government works and why they derived, why they came up with, why they developed the Federalist Papers. And I think there were some anti-Federalist papers,
there were,
too.
And we're going to talk about those.
So we'll touch on all of it this morning with a good professor. Thank you going out to our friends at SRG Financial Advisors for their assistance, Bill and Janice Lacasse, and the great staff that they have in Osage Beach, and also our friends at Lake TV for putting together our intro. So without further ado, why don't we turn things over to the good professor this morning and find out a little bit more about the Federalist Papers. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing great, and you?
Great to see you, sir.
Great. Well, this is interesting. You know, we've been watching the news lately, and everybody's scratching their head and saying, why doesn't the federal government do something about this, regardless of what the topic is? And sometimes the federal government has a tendency to do things, and you think, can they do that? Other times you think, where are they? And believe it or not, when this all started, when we formed this country, that was a huge discussion as to what is the power of the Congress and the federal government. And they were aware that this thing could get out of hand. And so what they came up with was a unique idea. They said, we need to limit the power of the federal government. Bear in mind, it was just 13 states when they started out. And they said, if we form this strong central government, how are we going to keep it from just running amok? And so they sat down, and when they drafted up the Constitution, they came up with a list of things the federal government can do. Now, believe it or not, when you look at all the things that are out there, there's only 27 things that they were allowed to do. 27. I don't know about you all, but I've seen a lot more than 27.
I think it's changed considerably.
Yes,
right.
You know, and those were simple things like, you know, they were the ones that coined the money. They were the ones that formed a post office. They're the ones that were responsible for national defense. They were the ones that could declare war, you know, because you didn't want one state declaring war, and, you know, it had to be, you know, a consensus. So they sat down and they drafted up this Constitution saying, okay, we want more centralized power, but we also don't want them to be overpowerful, all right? And the founders designed the government with the intention of resisting mob rule. Now, how does that fit today, right? Do you really want the mob running everything? And so what they did, you had James Madison, of all people, did some research ahead of time. In 1787, he got 2 trunkfuls of books sent to him from Thomas Jefferson, who was in Europe. And they were all books about ancient Rome and Greece. And he read all of those books to say, we need to look at what they had and how they managed to run it right into the ground. What made it fall apart? And so he comes into this thing, drafting up this Constitution with Athens, Greece in the back of his mind. How do we not make the same mistake that other people did in the past, okay? Now, he said that basically, quote unquote, he said, we want to avoid the fate of those ancient and modern confederacies, which he said had all succumbed to demagogues and mobs, okay? And as you watch this and you start reading about the Federalist Papers, you realize the very issues that we're dealing with today are the same ones that they were dealing with back then. And they're the ones that are going to have to put the government together. Now, Madison even went so far as to say, he said, if every person in Athens had been Socrates, it still would have been a mess. He said, because none of them could have agreed with one another. And there's where we are, right? Now, there was even an Athenian general by the name of Cleon. He said that guy swayed everybody into going into this Peloponnesian War. He said there was another guy named Solon, and he said, let's just cancel all our debts, and we'll just borrow money. So you can see back then they had the same problems. And they were saying, how do we control this, right? Now, what happened was, as soon as we formed our government, we immediately ran into problems in that some people weren't at all happy with it, and it actually led to something called Shays' Rebellion. And this was simply a bunch of farmers in Massachusetts that said, hey, we just fought a war on taxes, and now what's happening is we're being taxed by a government that we just created. How does that work, right? And I said, did we not fight a war to get out of this mess? And so immediately, we had a huge problem. Now, the Federalist Papers were actually written and published in the years 1787 and 1788. Now, a lot of people think, oh, this must be some highfalutin, a bunch of papers, by a bunch of eggheads and stuff. You know what they are? They're letters to the editor. That's all the Federalist Papers are. Letters to the editor. Because what happened is when they drafted up the Constitution, they had to have a 2/3 majority. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is they sent it out to everybody, to all the different states, and they said, here it is, tell us what you think. Well, naturally, the media back then was the newspapers, and so people started writing letters to the editor saying, we don't want to do this. We were under a king before, the last thing we need is a strong central government. But then what happened, they considered them the Federalist Papers, but then what happened is the opposition, these folks referred to themselves as the Anti-Federalists, and they're saying, no, we don't need a strong central government. We should be some sort of a confederation. All 13 states should have an equal say in what we do. So they have quite the conundrum to figure out. And so everybody's writing these letters to the newspapers to try and get people on board. And the Anti-Federalists are trying to convince people, don't vote for that Constitution, we don't want this. Make sense? So the Federalists want a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists say, no, we don't. That's the worst thing you could possibly have. Now, like I say, what I find fascinating about that was in 1787 they're having these discussions, all right? Now, all of the essays that were sent in were signed by the same person, Publius, okay? The authors on both sides that wrote in remained anonymous, and I guess, living in a small community, you want to be careful, what you say. Somebody might come knock on your door in the middle of the night. And so they were all anonymous. Now, the general consensus is that Alexander Hamilton wrote 52 of these letters to the editor, James Madison wrote 28, and John Jay contributed about 5 of them. These guys were all Federalists. They wanted the strong central government. And today, it's a great source for anybody that's interested in the federal government and knowing where our forefathers came from. I encourage you, come to the library. We have books on this. We have copies of these things. Read them. It's fascinating to hear what people thought about what could possibly go wrong, right? And boy, it's almost like they had a little crystal ball, right? Now, Madison referred to this mass of people as who have their own agendas as being factions. And in Federalist number 10, he said they were united and actuated by some common impulse of passion. In other words, they're not really thinking about long range. They're just, I want this done now. I don't want taxes. I don't want a central government, that sort of thing. And so very quickly, we see a division amongst the people, and it really gets to the point where they're really concerned whether or not they're going to be able to pull this off. And understand the rest of the world is watching us. They're saying, what are they going to do? Okay, fine, you defeated your king. Now you got it. What are you going to do? And most of the forefathers are saying, I don't know, I'm a pig farmer, right? And so now they got to sit down and figure something out. And that was the biggest issue, okay?
So let me ask you a quick question here. Anytime that you, let's say, work for a company, most companies have some sort of a manual to follow for various procedures, various protocols. And we know that sometimes people are very reactionary. They react to certain situations. Does it make sense then to have something like a constitution or something in place so that when things happen, you don't deal with it on an emotional or reactionary level. You have
Absolutely.
a plan in place that you can follow, and things get taken care of in a more calm
Yes.
type of approach, as
Yes.
opposed to everybody reacting,
Right.
and then things seemingly end up going
Right.
haywire.
Exactly, and I think we all see it in our jobs where you have policies and procedures,
Mm-hmm.
same kind of thing. But what we saw happen here is these guys, like I say, their entire lives had always lived under a king.
Right.
Their parents had lived under a king. Their grandparents lived under a king. And I always find that kind of humorous. They're saying, oh, well, the forefathers, they were really on top of things. Their grandparents, our forefathers, they had a problem with a king, one of the kings back then in England. You know what they did? They took him out and hung him. And then they cut his head off. And I'm like, well, that'll work, So, yeah, they had a history too. And I think it's interesting that they're making the effort to try and get something that works, but there's nothing to go off of.
Well, and you could almost apply that to modern times with Putin being put in power for the fifth go around.
Yeah,
So that seems like somewhat of a dictatorship or
right.
a king,
Right.
because I guess the only way they're going to get rid of this guy is if he passes, or
Yes.
if somebody takes him out.
And those of you who are as old as me, you can remember people like Khrushchev and Brezhnev and some of them, they just kind of faded off into history, didn't they? Kind of wonder where they wound up, But, it's interesting because they're looking at the difference between having a true democracy. A true democracy is majority rules. But we don't have a democracy here. Everybody says the United States is a democracy. It's not. We have federalism, and that's where the powers are shared. To give you an idea how bad the democracy can be, in ancient Athens, this is the books that Madison was studying. He found out that in Athens you had to have 6,000 citizens for a quorum. 6,000. I don't know about you guys, but if you get 5 people together and try and decide where to go to lunch, it's a huge deal, right?
Right,
Can you
absolutely.
imagine having 6,000 of them and say, okay, here's what we're going to do? So it was a mess, an absolute mess. And so they knew they didn't want this idea of a true democracy. The last thing we need is just, majority rules, because then you've lost complete control of the thing. But at the same time, they didn't want to be dictators. And so that's where they came up with this republic, the idea that the people would elect somebody to go and represent them in this new federal government. That's how it happened, okay? Now, what happened is that they also built into the Constitution a series of cooling mechanisms, they called them. And they were intended to basically inhibit the formulation of these factions from just saying, well, we've decided today that, we're going to be all socialists. Well, no, you can't do that. We're going to have checks and balances. And so they built it into that, which was brilliant back then of them to even think of it. I mean, they were thinking way ahead on a lot of the things they put in place, okay? So you wound up with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, okay? And they're trying to get this Constitution passed. Now, what's interesting is we study the Federalist Papers because those are the guys that won. They won out and said, we're going to have a strong central government. But it's really important to read the Anti-Federalist Papers because these guys put some restraints on these other guys. They said, all right, if you're going to have it, then we need things in there, checks and balances, to keep it from getting out of control. Now, the Anti-Federalists, don't get me wrong, they weren't opposed to a strong central government, but they wanted one that we could control. And like I say, in this day and age, they've got to be scratching their heads a little bit and spinning in their graves when they see what they're doing, right? Now, bottom line, Anti-Federalists are afraid that the central government have too much power. Now, it's thanks to the Anti-Federalists that we had the Bill of Rights drafted up, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech that allows us to even have shows like this, and, the right to keep and bear arms. All of those things, and I encourage you, look at the Bill of Rights. Just look at them. There's only 10 of them. Every one of those is a restriction on the federal government. Those aren't rights that the federal government is allowing us to have. Those are things that we said, we're not going to have a federal government unless you assure us that we get these things. So when you look at it from that perspective, you can see from day one, the people themselves feared this strong central government. And basically what they did is they told Madison and the boys in Hamilton, they said, I'm not signing it. We won't approve it. We'll just be 13 independent nations. But we're not going to sign this unless you add something like freedom of religion. We're very religious in our little colony. Or freedom of the press. Press is a big thing for us. And so what happened is Madison and the boys who were trying to get this thing passed, they'd sit there and say, fine, if I add something here, an amendment to your Constitution, then would you sign it? And they talked to one another and said, yeah, probably. And so he pulled his pen out, all right, I'll add that. And as he went around to the colonies, they're adding all of these amendments, and we're not going to pass it unless you put that in there. And so it got to the point where they had so many amendments that Congress was meeting, and they said, well, how many other things are they going to come up with? What about the things in the future that come up? How are you going to make it a right, for this to, be a restriction on the federal government? And that's when they came up with the 10th Amendment. And the 10th one said, if it's not in there, it goes to the state. Now, isn't that something?
Right.
Most people aren't aware of that. If it's not in the U.S. Constitution, then the state has jurisdiction. Now, I encourage you, go back and look at the U.S. Constitution. Is there anything in the U.S. Constitution about the EPA? Is there anything in there about education? No, it's not in there. So now how do we have a federal Department of Education when they don't have any jurisdiction to have it? Somehow they said, well, it's necessary and proper. Well, there's the catch. Politicians are good at what they do. And they said, well, if they're going to put that in there, then I think what we ought to do is we ought to also say that Congress should have the ability to pass any law that's necessary and proper for us to be able to do these 10 things. Well, necessary and proper has gotten a bit out of control.
Right.
Right?
It sure has.
But, it's kind of a catch-22. And this is why lawyers spend all their time in Washington, D.C., arguing back and forth about whether or not the federal government can do this or they can't do this. You'll hear necessary and proper all the time. They even have a nickname for it. They call it the elastic clause.
Oh.
Yes. It's elastic. It'll be okay. Trust me. All right? I'm from the government.
Huh, yeah. I'm here to help. From the government, I'm here to help. Right.
Right, exactly. So the Bill of Rights became a huge issue, okay? Now, in response to that, Alexander Hamilton said, hey, I think we ought to have an unlimited federal government, okay? He's the guy that's all for basically creating, a government that doesn't have to answer to anybody. And, he wrote in Federalist 23, he said, he expressed the dangerous view that there can be no limitation of the authority, which is to provide the defense and protection of the community. In other words, the government can do anything in the name of public safety. Have you ever heard that before? Right? Okay.
In the name or under the guise?
Yes, exactly. And so you can see what a huge issue this was for these guys to fight this back and forth. Now, Hamilton also pushed for the power of direct taxation. He said, how are we going to run this thing if we don't have any money? He said, we ought to be able to tax the people. And the Anti-Federalists immediately came back and said, if you can tax us, what's to keep you from taxing us at, I don't know, 20, 30%, right? Where does it end? How much can you tax us? And so there was another huge battle, and he lost that battle at the time. Most people don't realize that when the country was founded, the federal government couldn't tax anybody. It wasn't until we passed the 16th Amendment in the 20th century that they allowed them to start taxing, okay? Prior to that, everything was done with tariffs. And, they put a tariff on trade that came in. There wasn't any federal tax at all. And what they did is they sent out notes to each of the states every year, and they said, we're doing what we can to protect you on the high seas and all this, and we'd really like you all to determine a donation that you'd like to make to the federal government. And they'd say, and in our mind, your donation should be $3 million. And the state would come back and say, we're thinking 500,000. And that's the way it worked. Wouldn't that be great now? You turn around and have the federal government turn around and hit you with that tax. And I said, no, I don't think that's, I think I've got a different number in mind. Here, I'll just slide that to you.
So it's kind of like if you're looking for a car.
Yeah.
And you find one, and the owner wants this much.
Right.
But of course, you only want to pay this much.
Right.
So you try to meet in the middle. So it's a form of haggling.
Yeah, it
Right.
basically was.
Okay.
But the nice thing about it is Congress had to tippy toe on this because Congress didn't have a hammer.
Right.
And so that was kind of an interesting deal in that, this whole taxation issue isn't something, that's something of our generation. They didn't have it back then, okay? Now, what was interesting is, these anti-federalists, who were they? The Sentinel was Samuel Bryan. He was the son of George Bryan and a judge on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. There was another fellow by the name of Federal Farmer. He started signing his name as Federal Farmer. And there's a guy named Melancton Smith. He was a New York delegate to the Continental Congress. Richard Henry Lee was another one. He was president of the Continental Congress. Brutus, who wrote a lot of the Anti-Federalist Papers, he was Robert Yates, a politician and a judge. And then Cato was George Clinton, and he was the first governor of New York. And finally, the big one, Patrick Henry. And yes, it is the same Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. So you got some pretty powerful folks arguing on the side of the Anti-Federalists and saying, we're not going to have this all-powerful central government, okay? Now, the Anti-Federalists, I want you to listen to this. This is what really blows my mind. Here's the deal. They're saying we don't want to ratify this Constitution because of the following reasons. First, it gives too much power to the national government at the expense of state governments. Now, I want you to think about that in relation to where we are today. Second, there was no Bill of Rights in it. This is before they added the Bill of Rights. He said, another thing they said was that the national government could maintain an army in peacetime. The last thing we need is a big army that if we decide we're not going to pay the taxes, they'll come in and force us to pay them. And they said Congress, because of their necessary and proper clause, that they basically said it wielded too much power. Necessary and proper, they'll just make stuff up and say this is necessary. Now, again, I want to remind you, this is in 1787 they could see it. Back then, they could already see it. And then the last one, I love this, the executive branch would have too much power. Isn't that great? So, these guys were pretty sharp for back in the day. Now, basically what we saw then was the Federalists, and these guys were some heavy hitters as well, all right? Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, he was the first Treasury Secretary. And, basically, like I say, he wanted direct taxation. And it wasn't until 1909 with the 16th Amendment that we actually had a federal tax. So he lost that point. But even in those earliest days, that federal bureaucracy was a huge problem. And I want to read you a quote from Thomas Jefferson, who was an anti-federalist. He went to Washington, and here's what he said. He said he discovered agencies upon agencies in every part of the earth and for the most useless or mischievous purposes, and all of these opening doors for fraud and embezzlement far beyond the ostensible profits of the agencies. That's what he had to say about the federal government in 1787, all right? He's already seeing it. Everything's a big bureaucracy. People are doing things. He has no idea why they're doing it. It was just a disaster. And he said, you've created a monster all the way back then.
But it's necessary and proper.
It was necessary and proper, my friend. Yeah, okay. Now, basically, this guy, this Federalist by the name of Brutus, Anti-Federalist Brutus, he came in and he said he criticized the Constitution because it gives the Congress general and unlimited power. So, can you imagine you know, if today we were having these very same debates and some of the things you could bring forward for your arguments, because that's the key here. The thing was originally set up with the states having a shared power. And now what we see is, for some reason, we've kind of slipped back a little bit, and the states are basically telling the federal government, you know. Now, you know how they do it? That 16th Amendment. You send us your taxes, all right? You work all day long, you send the taxes, and the taxes go to the federal government, and then the federal government will hold those taxes, and then you come back and say, we have something that's necessary and proper, right? And we say, well, we don't think it is. And say, would you like your money back? Yes. Well, unless you do what we ask you, then we're not going to give you your federal tax dollars back. That was where everything really changed. That was a big shift. Bear in mind, before that, if the federal government said we want X amount of dollars from you, they could say, no, we choose not to participate. So that was a big shift in how things were done. Now, like I say, the Anti-Federalists, these included people like Samuel Bryan, the son of George Bryan, you know, and Patrick Henry. So they're going to dig their heels in. They're going to be tough, okay? Now, the Federalists, like I say, these guys included Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. He was from a wealthy family in New York. All of these folks carried a ton of clout. These were the movers and shakers. Most of them had been big into businesses in the north, plantations in the south. I mean, and there's something else to think about. The people who were in the positions of power, they were the ones that had the time to do it. The rest of us are out there swinging an axe and trying to clear land and try to feed our families. It was the wealthy that basically came in and set this thing up. And don't get me wrong, thank God they were there. They were smart. They knew what they were doing. But thank God there were people on both sides of the argument, okay? And the rest of the world, like I say, they're stepped back. Most of the world thought what we'd have was 13 new states or countries. And think about it. Some of our states are the same size as countries in Europe.
Absolutely.
And so a lot of people thought that's what was going to happen. And when we finally came out with the Constitution, they said they're a what? United what? United States of America? What's that? And sure enough, we all pulled together and made it happen. So kudos.
So at one point, you've got a group of people who would like to see a centralized system be put in place. So you didn't have 13, let's say, different types of currency. That's probably a good way to look at that, because if you try to use that currency in another state, will it work? Is it the same value? So on and so forth. So I guess, you know, money talks, as they say, and you know what walks. But
Right.
this is the whole point behind trying to do something on the centralized level. Well, at the same time, you have all of these people that are trying to move this whole United States of America along, but then there are people, as is the case, who are watching them and watching them very closely and making sure that this, not necessarily absolute power, but a power of sorts, you know, they say absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes.
And we start to meander down this whole path of two different schools of thought, but that's where your checks and balances come into play.
Right.
And that's what's very important about this, because as we see in this day and age, when the federal government gets on board with a particular program, they find ways to implement it, not necessarily coming right out and saying that this is what we're going to do, but we'll create a bureau, we'll create a department.
Absolutely.
And that department will be responsible for this particular issue, whether it's the EPA, Department of Education, talking green energy, things along those lines, because we don't have time to focus on it, but we're going to create a department. So then, of course, you have a centralized government, you have little branches of that government, these little departments, and then they start to create their own little, hear that sucking sound?
Yes.
Those are your tax dollars going to these various departments, because we're doing it because it's necessary and proper. We have to have some sort of guidance. We have to have some sort of program in place, so as this country grows, we can absorb all the different things that are going to happen.
Right.
But are we doing this properly, and are we doing it in a way that's beneficial to the people, or is it again someone who deep down inside who comes out, as we know when we watch various things on TV, you know, they're selling you a bill of goods over here, but you know in the back room what's actually taking place.
Right. And you're dead on. You know, even with the money thing, before one of the things they said is the federal government should coin the money. Well, the reason why was Virginia had their own Virginia dollars, Pennsylvania had their own dollars, New York had their own dollars, and guess what? My Virginia dollar was only worth 50 cents compared to a New York dollar that was $2.
Right.
The exchange rate was terrible, and it made it a mess to regulate trade, and that's where we got into this necessary and proper stuff.
There you go.
You know, so you know the things that they picked out of there that should be federal government regulations, they made sense. It was smart to do it, but then, like you say, the devil was in the details.
Absolutely.
If you will. So, bottom line is, we came down to the point where we want this thing to pass, you know, and get some sort of a government going, because bear in mind, we just won this war. We're laying there wide open for France or England or somebody else to come back and try and attack us again and take it. They say, well, they aren't organized. And that's where Ben Franklin made his famous quote, because some of these people would stand up in the Continental Congress and say, the heck with it, I'm just going to blow out of here. I'll join up with Canada, or I'll be an independent nation. And Ben Franklin said we must all hang together, or we will surely all hang separately. You know, and so he was saying, you know, we need to get over our differences and come up with something. And that's what they did, okay? And the Bill of Rights, like I say, was probably the most important thing. And it was simply a matter of when they put these articles to the newspapers, people would say, that's all well and good, but unless you guarantee me that I have freedom of religion, then the people here aren't going to sign it. And so, like I say, look at those Bill of Rights. Each and every one of the Bill of Rights is a restriction on the federal government. They have things in there like search and seizure. Where'd that come from? Well, when the British were there, the British could come in, kick in your door, and take anything they wanted. And so we need to make sure that we don't have a new government that can do the same thing. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it applied to the abuses they suffered under British rule, and then these are the things they thought this would be nice to have, you know. And so it really is, you know, there's a story, if you will. It's fascinating to look at it, and like I say, when you go back and look at the Federalist Papers, the main thing I want you to remember is these are nothing more than letters to the editor. This is your neighbor writing into the paper and saying, that guy's crazy. This is what we have to have. And back and forth they went, and it really is a miracle that they could come up with a compromise. That's probably one of the best things about our government is over the years we've been able to come up with compromises and get something that works. And here we are, over 200 years later, and it's still working, folks.
Does the term necessary and proper apply to the Bill of Rights? And I say that because in certain instances, various things like freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, illegal search and seizure, could someone come along and say, well, I know that we've established the Bill of Rights, but in this particular instance, necessary and proper kind of falls into line here because of some extenuating circumstances. It's hard to take something like freedom of speech because we hear it all the time.
Right.
And utilize that across the board because so many people have their own interpretation of it. And I think the biggest reason for that is a lot of people don't understand what freedom of speech really means.
Sure.
You have people that utilize it from the sense that they want to be able to get up and speak and say what's on their mind. You have other people who utilize it from the standpoint of, well, hate speech is protected under freedom of speech.
Right.
And in this particular instance, we consider it necessary and proper to kind of go above and beyond how it was initially worded and initially thought up. And so then you start going in all different directions with the Bill of Rights. Yeah. Certainly, as we hear now, the right to bear arms. Right. A lot of people refer to this in particular as, well, you know, that was something that was developed back in the 1700s, and now it doesn't apply on the level because the government is trying so desperately to take firearms away from the people. Mm-hmm. And we know that we have this write the right to bear arms in the Bill of Rights, but is it still interpreted the same way now as it was initially created then? And so, there's so many of these things that you look at and how perplexing it is considering the times that we live in. But this all kind of rolls back to our main theme that you and I started talking about years ago, and that's how modern day situations and how they apply to history.
Yes.
And I find this so very interesting, especially when you talk about other things like various departments that are created, Department of Education, EPA, you name it, and how they are now almost doing things virtually on their own without the support of the federal government, or maybe they have the backing of certain parts of the federal government, but not the whole thing. And in a lot of instances, they have no backing whatsoever from the people because we see it for what it is.
Right. Well, and, you bring up such great points. Is it okay to go into a crowded movie theater and holler fire? Well, now you're freedom of speech. What's my right? I have freedom of speech. No, wrong. Let me ask you, when you all leave here today, will you get in your car and put on a seatbelt? Why? Is that in the U.S. Constitution, anybody? Seatbelts? I know horse and buggies were dangerous, but I don't think they had them, right? Well, again, the thing is, part of it was, the government's supposed to make the roads. Well, then the roads, there's regulations on what the roads should be, and then you expand that a little bit further and say people are getting killed on the roads. Well, maybe we need to, as necessary and proper, we ought to put some safety things in there. And there it is. And what was interesting about that, I grew up in an age where you didn't have seat belts. But if you'll remember correctly, when they passed the seatbelt laws, every one of those was a state law. The federal government went to the states and said, you're going to have to pass a seatbelt law, or I'm going to hold the money that you gave me. And so that's why we wear seatbelts. So the federal government is saying, yes, this is your jurisdiction, states, but how many of us have ever heard of an unfunded mandate, right? And that's where it comes. That's where we get wrapped around the axle, folks. And you got to hand it to these guys. We've got a document that was created in 1787. They didn't know anything about, all the latest technology with the different drugs that are made for curing cancer and all of the different experiments that are done and AI and the technology. And yet, somehow they've got to make the document apply. And so far, all in all, compared to any place else in the world, I think what they came up with was brilliant. I really do. If you take the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, mesh those together, you've really got something. And I encourage each and every one of you, if you find the topic interesting, please come into the libraries. Any one of our 6 branches, we've got books pulled on these various topics. These individuals, oh my gosh, stories about Hamilton and Adams and all of them, fascinating stories. They were people just like us.
You mentioned how someone received a tub of books and read them all. I find that fascinating because I don't believe a whole lot of people would do that today.
No.
And again, you let a media kind of run your narrative. And that's certainly something that's very interesting and something that I think a lot of people almost live for, because we're in this workaday world. Everybody's going 20 different directions. You've got kids, you've got a job, you've got other interests, hobbies, whatever. And so you don't take the time necessary. And here again, folks, you're being presented with a great opportunity to go to one of the 6 branches of the Camden County Library District and research not only the Federalist Papers, but all the people involved. I'm sure it would take a while to read everything, but in this day and age, isn't it worth it? Well, I guess that's up to you.
And like I say, be James Madison. Get you a tub of books and sit down and read them. If you're interested in a topic, do it. I mean, it's a fascinating individual.
And I noticed, in addition to your dissertation here this morning on the Federalist Papers, there is quite a bit of information that people can access. I see a lot of anti-Federalist things on here, but the index to the anti-Federalist Papers, you've got plenty of that.
There's some dandies right there, things like, if we give all this power to the federal government, or what happens to the states? There's a whole list of things. I love the taxing one. If you let them tax us, what stops them from just taxing us to death? And I thought, man, those guys were sharp, you know. So,
Well, and we're seeing how the federal government can manipulate the states, obviously, with the withholding of money for various things that they need. And then the topic always comes to the top of the stack where, well, why don't we just not send our tax dollars to the federal government? Well, then they've got something in place for that.
yeah.
And so they've got people out there that are doing their homework, but I think whoever, if it was an individual or a group of people that came up with the necessary and proper phrase,
Yes.
that person or persons, those persons, they did themselves a huge favor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
It's like a back door.
That's where everything eventually comes down to is the 10th Amendment, as it says the states have jurisdiction if it's not in the Constitution, versus the necessary and proper clause.
Well,
That's
and
where most of the arguments are happening in the federal government.
I think a large part of that then gives the federal government a reason to say why they need something and then why they can sidestep the people in order to make it happen.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Just amazing.
Yeah.
I don't know, do any of the folks out there with us this morning have any questions, any thoughts, any ideas, anything that you would like to find out a little bit more? We've got the professor here.
Biden is getting ready to sign with the WHO to give up our sovereignty. Can that be reversed?
That's a great point. You know, again, I think where the challenge would be that the audience member said she was concerned that if the president signs with the WHO and gives us our sovereignty, can he do that? And here again, you know, you go back and read the Federalist Papers where they're saying the executive powers are too big. That was the argument, and so they put limitations on them, and that's where you have the three branches of government. And if he ever tried to do something, if he could get it passed through the Supreme Court and the legislature, then I suppose, yes, he could. But supposedly the checks and balances are strong enough to keep that from happening. And let's face it, folks, our government has already been down this path in the 1860s when they said, does the federal government have the right to tell me what I can and can't do? You know, when we fought the whole issue over states' rights for the Civil War, you know, the people in the South were saying, okay, slavery is the issue you're picking on, but if you can do away with my property there, then what keeps you from coming out tomorrow and saying, I can't have a horse, or I can't raise tobacco, or I can't raise corn, whatever it might be? That was where the big issue was, is who ultimately has the power, the state or the federal government? And I think if you had something like the World Health Organization, I think you would see the states rally together and say, absolutely not, we've already given up enough.
This month.
Yes, I know.
Well, and this brings up another interesting topic based on the question that you posed to Professor Pasley. When all of this was initially looked at and they were sitting down to talk about it, they were essentially just concerned on one particular area, and that's the United States of America. And now we have all of these other countries around us that we interact with and various things that we've been involved with, United Nations,
World trade.
World Trade, World Health Organization, all of these other groups and organizations that feel that we as a world, as an entire planet, have to get on board with a certain way of thinking.
Right.
And that's not necessarily true. And you see, and what's interesting is you look at some of these smaller countries, especially in places like maybe Central America, Africa, that are run by dictators.
Right.
And they have nothing like this in place at all.
No.
It's either do as I say, or, you know, maybe you find yourself swinging from a tree.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
whatever. But
You're exactly right.
the main thing about it is then how do you incorporate what other countries and other groups and what other organizations outside of the United States want? How does that apply to what we already have in place? Do we modify that? Is it, again, necessary and proper?
And it's a great question.
That's a great,
because you get back into things like the UN Security Council. You know, you've got members on there, China and Russia are on the Security Council. What if they get together and they vote and they said, yeah, we're going to go to war over here tomorrow? And that was the big argument with the United Nations from day one, was they said, wait, Congress has the authority to decide where we go to war. And you're relegating that to the United Nations. And Congress threw a fit over that, an absolute fit over that. And so here again, does our federal government have the power to regulate or to basically hand over certain things that we have in our Constitution and say, no, that specifically needs to go to the Supreme Court, or it needs to go to our Congress. They vote on it.
But that's my point. As far as I'm aware, this hasn't been through Congress.
Right.
This is an executive act.
And that'll wind up in court for sure, you know. And to answer the question, no, he can't do that, you know. But then again, sometimes what we see is it's better to ask for forgiveness and permission, and we see him do this in declaring war. Again, that's strictly, it says right there, Congress is the only one that can do it. But how many times have we had presidents drag us into a conflict, you know, through history, you know, that they just decided, you know, I think it's a good idea to do this, and then go to Congress afterwards. Well, it isn't supposed to work that way. Yeah, the system has some flaws. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could go through historically a little bit the United States on the big debate between federalism and anti-federalism, and the presidents that represented each.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, he said, you know, when you look back at history and you look at what we see happen as the pendulum swinging one way or the other, based on what party's in charge, what president is in charge, it gets to be quite an issue in that you see a lot of presidents come in. Well, let's take FDR for an example. FDR came in, we had the issue with the Great Depression. Well, he just basically, you know, made it up as he went, you know, and some of the things he did were great, some of them were terrible. You know, he declared a bank holiday, closed all the banks. Just closed it. You know, where is that in the Constitution that you can do something like that, right? Or creating all of these WPA and the CCC, where's that in the Constitution? It's not there. You had people like Wilson come in, and he had a whole different progressive outlook on how things should be. Abraham Lincoln, he came in and said, I don't have a problem with slavery. It can exist as it sits now. Most people don't know that. He said, but I just don't want it expanded to the West. Well, here again, that's not his call. That was the call of Congress gets to decide if new states coming in do that. So there's a long history, and you make a great point.
What about Jackson?
Oh, Jackson. Yeah, I mean, that guy, I mean, he was a loose cannon. And, you know, he just kind of, you know, well, you know, I think we got a problem with you know, the Indians down south, and he went in and just wiped them out. You know, the president didn't even, you know, or, you know, most of the members of Congress didn't even know what he was doing. He's down there wiping out the Seminoles and everybody else and grabbing the northern part of Florida, which was Spain at the time. And they're like, he did what? Right? You know, and this happens a lot.
He was an anti-federalist.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. You had any number of incidents. Teddy Roosevelt was Secretary of the Navy. He grabbed the Philippines when we were fighting in Cuba. And they turned around and said, he did what? Oh, he just took the Philippines. What? You know, well, there we were. Now we're fighting there. So, you know, time and again, these things have happened. And, you know, it's interesting to watch. But it is also fascinating to me that, you know, our forefathers had the foresight to look at this and say, okay, here's your fallback. You can come back and at least tell that guy, no, you can't do that. It's right here, you know. And then we try and hash it out. But, yeah, it's interesting. I encourage you, read the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers.
Do yourself a favor, read them both and understand both sides of the argument. Exactly. You mentioned something else, executive orders.
Yes.
Which I think in a lot of instances have gotten out of control, as most people would probably agree with that statement, depending on how you feel, where you fall in the political spectrum. But that may even be a topic for another show.
Yeah,
that would be
be
great to know, because as is the case, some presidents issue executive orders, and as soon as they're out of office, the next person comes in and wipes a bunch of them right off the slate.
Yeah,
We want to, again, thank you, sir,
you bet.
for, making us stop and think. And I would encourage people, most everyone who's watching us or here today, to take the time to stop and think. Don't necessarily believe everything at face value. Take the time to utilize the resources available throughout the Camden County Library District, ccld.us, and then you can go to a whole mess of different places. They've got a wonderfully laid out website. As a matter of fact, Mark was showing me the website and some of the things that are on it. And of course, you can visit the branches and go in. The Camdenton branch is just a phenomenal facility, and it's certainly a great place to do as much research as you possibly can with every opportunity to come in here. And they've got so many great things going on. As a matter of fact, we need to talk about some of those things.
Let's talk about.
We've got a great lineup of items and events that are coming up. We've got, of course, summer reading programs. We've got things for Mother's Day. We've got things for Father's Day. But if you'd like to learn more about the Federalist Papers, you can do that and read all 85 essays. All 85. Plus, learn about all of the players as well. You can find a link to the essays and more from EBSCO, Host, and Explora. When the patrons use Explora General Research, they can find the latest news, articles, and consumer information, along with all of the ebooks, peer-reviewed articles, academic journals. You've got a whole mess of good stuff, biographies to aid in your research, and you can use this resource to start your journey or to supplement what you find in the physical libraries when you come into places like the Camdenton branch, the Osage Beach branch, Climax Springs. You've got them all over the place. And take the time, again, to go to the website if you are in a particular part of the county. You can go to ccld.us and find out where the closest branch is located near you. Also, the EBSCO host online resources, including Explora, they're available 24/7 from the Camden County Library District online resources website, ccld.us/digital-library/. As a quick reminder, when accessing EBSCO host from home, they ask that you please use the link at the top of the page. If you need assistance, don't hesitate to ask one of the friendly staff members. So basically, you could probably come in here and use it, and if you run into a problem, guess what? There's plenty of people here to help you.
Great librarians in every one of our facilities. Be more than happy to help you.
Absolutely, all of the branches. Well, friends, summer vacation is getting very close for the kiddos. I hear people talking about kids graduating and summertime, and parents are wondering maybe what they can do to help entertain the kids. Well, it's the Camden County Library District to the rescue with their Summer Reading Challenge, kicking off right here at the Camdenton Library. It's going to be on Saturday, June the 1st from 10 until 2. Lots of entertainment. You've got Sparky the Clown, Babaloo, face painting with Mary Mary, also music from the Lake of the Ozarks Blues Society. You can enjoy food from Not Just Any Place Cafe food truck, and check out all the great craft vendors that they have available to you as well if you're looking for a unique gift. Don't forget, Father's Day is right around the corner, and they'll have booths for kids to play games and make different crafts. And don't forget to sign up for the Summer Reading Challenge. Have you ever done one of those, a reading challenge, where you have to read a certain amount of books?
Oh, yeah. Back in the day, you know.
Back in the day.
It was all printed on papyrus.
What was it now?
It was a long time ago.
Yeah. You were alongside the Egyptians making your papyrus
That's
paper?
right, yeah.
All right, very good. Well, I think it's a great opportunity, and certainly, you know, your kids are probably going to come away a lot smarter, maybe even some adults as well. Could adults sign up for the adults, the kids, everybody is eligible to sign up for the Summer Reading Challenge. And don't forget, when they kick it off, it's going to be on Saturday, June the 1st, right here at the Camdenton Library, the branch right here in Camdenton, 10 to 2, all kinds of entertainment, vendors, face painters, food truck, lots of fun stuff, and a good way to get kids motivated to bury their noses in a good book. Also coming up, they invite you to join them, later today, as a matter of fact, at the Camdenton Library to participate in the CCLD Smartphone Shutterbugs class. Now, I don't know how many of you take pictures with your phones. Do it all the time. Do you take the greatest pictures? Well, maybe you do. Maybe you get lucky once in a while.
My finger, my thumb, yeah.
This is where the the phrase "better to be lucky than good"
Right.
really comes into play. Unless, of course, you get involved with the classes that they're going to have available, or this particular instance, a class. You can learn tips and tricks on taking better photos with the camera you carry with you all the time. Our classes have covered the rule of thirds, black and white versus color, getting close to your subject, and more. So what's nice about it is you don't always have to maybe fiddle around with the settings
Right.
if you know what you're doing.
Right.
And how often do we see events on video or events as far as pictures, things that unfold right in front of our eyes, and we want some sort of a memento, some sort of a remembrance of the occasion, or you see a blind possum walking through your
There
street
you
that's,
go.
well,
Yeah.
you never know. I actually took some pictures of him the other day. We also ask you to savor the flavor with us at the Osage Beach Library once a month when they sample and share recipes based on the month's cooking theme. They encourage you to bring vegan-friendly dishes for the Friday, May 10th meeting at 1:30. What are some of the other themes they're going to have? Do you know, Coley?
There's going to be some on crock pot recipes.
Crock pot recipes.
1 cup or 1 dish recipes.
So you don't have leftovers.
That's right.
Those things in this day and age, when you go to the store and you see food prices and they blow your mind, and you know you'd like to have maybe a ribeye, but you can't afford 10 of them,
Right.
or you can get one someplace and
Right.
savor it and enjoy it. And certainly crock pot cooking, I mean, I think that makes all the sense in the world. If you're busy, you can throw it all in the crock pot, turn it on, and go do your thing. So check that out again, May the 10th. It's a Friday, and the meeting starts at 1:30. Don't forget Mother's Day is fast approaching. How fast? Well, it's this Sunday. For those of you who don't know, this may come as somewhat of a news bulletin, a news alert to a lot of people. I
Right.
can't get over it, quite frankly. I can't get over how many kids don't remember Mother's Day or don't even know it's coming up.
Right.
And then everybody's got to kind of scramble. Well,
Yep.
it's, as I said, this Sunday, May 12th to be exact. They invite you and your children to join them at the Max Creek Library for a special story time honoring moms on Saturday, May the 11th at 10:30. They'll read stories, sing songs, and give you kids an opportunity to save face with mom as you can make a craft or crafts there for mom. The Stoutland Library invites kids to wear their favorite pajamas and bring their most favoritist stuffy. There's people that are actually going to be looking up the word favoritist. It's going to be on Saturday, May the 10th.
May the
I'm
11th.
screwing this all up.
Saturday, May
Saturday,
the
May.
11th.
Thank you so much. I'm
Yes,
so
sir.
glad you're here. It's been an early morning for me.
Yes.
It starts at 10:30. Bedtime themed story time. They'll read some of their favorite bedtime stories, sing songs, recite rhymes, and play with bubbles.
Yeah,
You're never too old to play with bubbles.
No.
As a matter of fact, if you come to my house,
Yeah.
out on the back deck, on the table, we've got 2 things of bubbles.
And I imagine Lightning the dog loves that.
He loves the bubbles. The cat not so much, but I enjoy irritating the squirrels with
Yeah.
him. Well, if you're ready to go on an adventure with us as well, you can join the Osage Beach Library on Wednesday, May 29th at 10:30 as they explore the sights and sounds of the animal world. It's going to be going on this summer with their friends from the Wonders of Wildlife as they embark on the ED venture with a Wonders of Wildlife educator who's going to have a chance to explore and learn more about different animal habitats as they track and observe their favorite critters, big and small. Don't know if you're going to run across any bears. I think there'll probably be something within reason. Be prepared to hop, skip, tiptoe, and more coming up Wednesday, May 29th at 10:30 as they learn more about the adventurous animals. And of course, a great event, and these are great folks. They love supporting the community. The folks over there at Bridal Cave, teaming up with the CCLD to invite you to go on a reading adventure with them. They invite you to visit any of the 6 branches, Bridal Cave, or just about all of Bridal Cave's lake map stops to pick up your bookmark reading log. You'll discover more information about 3 of Bridal Cave's hidden gems on the front of the bookmark. On the back side, they encourage you to log your reading to earn a free piece of rock candy, which is a good deal, all the sugar you can handle. Bridal Cave's gift shop is where they'll have those for you. To earn your free piece of rock candy, you must read at least 3 books about caves, cave life, geology, spelunking, or the great outdoors, and 2 of your choosing. Record the titles on the back of the bookmark when you've completed reading all 5 books. then return the bookmark to Bridal Cave, get your piece of rock candy, you're good to go. This is open to all ages, and you can participate as many times as you like, but please choose different titles each time. Folks, we are at the end of the program. Again, we want to thank all of you folks for coming, our great behind-the-scenes staff,
Mark and Coley.
Coley and Mark, and of course, Vicki and everybody that works in this branch and throughout the Camden County Library District, all the librarians and all the support staff. They do an amazing job. They're great folks to know, great folks to visit with, full of useful information. And we want to thank some of our helpers, SRG Financial Advisors, Lake TV. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Great to have you on board again.
We do education next.
We'll do education next, and we're going to kind of let the month of May transpire, kind of work through all of that, and we'll pick up another show of the Chapter and Chatter Cafe right here from this beautiful location, the Camden branch of the Camden County Library District, on June the 6th. We'll see you at 8 a.m. Join us on YouTube or live and in person. Until then, great to have you with us. We'll see you again next time, everybody. God bless.